She arrived on a wagon that rattled with the town's cruel laughter, a ghost of a woman sent to a ghost of a man. Her name was Maeve, a name whispered like a prayer her mother had once taught her, though she had long forgotten the comfort of faith. She was payment for a debt, a piece of human chattel passed to the town's most venomous matriarch, Mrs. Thatcher, who now used her as a pawn in a heartless game. The wager was simple: send the disgraced woman to the reclusive mountain man, Caleb, the subject of fearful gossip and crude jokes. They called him a beast, a hermit grown monstrously large in his grief-stricken isolation. The final, humiliating task assigned to Maeve was to fulfill the town's mocking fantasy, to bathe the fat mountain man, to scrub the grime and sorrow from a man they believed was less than human. Maeve clutched the thin bundle of her belongings, her knuckles white. She had survived worse than laughter. She had survived the silence after the fever took her family, the gnawing hunger, the cold that seeped into bone. The town's scorn was just another bitter wind. When the wagon left her at the foot of a path choked with weeds, the silence that descended was absolute. The cabin was a thing of stone and shadow, hunched against the mountain like a wounded animal. It was a fortress built of grief. Caleb stood in the doorway, a figure carved from the twilight. He was not fat, she saw instantly. He was broad, powerful, a man built of the same rugged substance as the mountain he inhabited. But it was his stillness that was most profound, a stillness that absorbed all sound, all light. His eyes, set deep in a face etched with a pain too old for his years, held no welcome, only a vast, desolate emptiness. He did not speak. He simply held out a hand, not in greeting, but to point toward the small, dark room that would be hers. He then placed a single, tarnished coin on a dusty table, a cold, clear transaction. She was not a guest. She was a service, purchased and paid for. The door closed, and she was left in a silence that was heavier than any stone. The first day, Maeve moved through the house like a phantom, her presence a quiet counterpoint to years of neglect. The air was thick with the dust of disuse and the faint, metallic scent of old grief. Every surface was coated in a fine grey powder, a shroud over a life that had stopped dead. Caleb was a shadow at the edge of her vision, watching from darkened doorways, his presence a constant, silent weight. He did not question her, did not direct her. He simply observed, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. Maeve began not with scrubbing, but with listening. She listened to the house's groans, to the wind scraping against the windows like a dry whisper, to the profound, aching silence where a woman's laughter and a child's footsteps should have been. She found a chipped mug, a woman's sewing basket with a thimble still inside, a small, hand-carved rocking horse with one runner broken. These were the artifacts of a buried life. She did not touch them, not yet. Instead, she opened the shutters. A spear of afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a million dancing dust motes, and for the first time, the room seemed to breathe. She swept the floor, her motions rhythmic and steady. The whisper of her broom was the only sound. Later, she found the cold hearth and a small supply of flour and dried beans. She built a fire, its first crackle a shock in the stillness. Soon, the scent of baking bread, simple, honest, warm, began to fill the cold corners of the cabin. It was the smell of life, a defiant trespasser in this kingdom of sorrow. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway, his large frame filling the space. His eyes were fixed on the rising loaf, and in their depths, something flickered, a memory, a pain, a ghost of a forgotten warmth. He said nothing. But as she placed the bread on the table between them, he did not turn away. He sat, and they ate together in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken language of a shared, simple sustenance. In the days that followed, the house began a slow, reluctant transformation. Maeve was a force of quiet reclamation. The windows, once clouded with grime, were now clear, letting in the pale mountain sun. The floors were swept clean, the scent of wood smoke and herbs replacing the stale air of neglect. She worked without command, her intuition guiding her. She found a small garden patch, overgrown and choked with weeds, and began to patiently clear it, her hands turning over the cold, dormant earth. She was preparing for a spring she wasn't certain she would be there to see. Caleb remained a creature of distance and shadow, his routines unchanged. He would leave at dawn with his rifle and return at dusk, a brace of rabbits or a bird slung over his shoulder. He would place the offering on the porch without a word and retreat into himself. Yet, a subtle shift was occurring. He no longer watched her with pure suspicion, but with a kind of weary curiosity. He saw the way she mended his torn shirt, her stitches small and neat. He saw the single wildflower she placed in a jar on the windowsill. These were small, gentle acts of creation in a world he had allowed to decay. One afternoon, while clearing a dusty shelf, her fingers brushed against a small, locked door, no bigger than a bread box, set into the wall. It was the only thing in the house that seemed deliberately sealed away. It felt cold to the touch. She respected its boundary, understanding that some doors were not meant to be opened by strangers. Her true discovery came later, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her own small room, a tiny, worn rag doll with button eyes. It was crudely made, but clearly loved. Holding it, Maeve finally understood. The silence in the house wasn't just his, it was a shared silence. There was another soul here, a smaller one, hiding in the cracks of this immense grief. The child appeared as silently as the first frost. Her name was Lily, a whisper of a girl with her father's solemn eyes and a stillness that spoke of a deep, learned fear. For days, Maeve had only caught glimpses of her, a flicker of movement in a hallway, a small face peering from a half-open door before vanishing. Maeve never pushed, never called out. She simply left a small piece of cornbread on the hearth each evening, or hummed a quiet tune as she worked, weaving a gentle net of safety and patience. Then, one morning, as Maeve sat on the porch step mending a blanket, the little girl approached. In her small, outstretched hand was a gift, a bird, carved from a single piece of pine, its wings rough and uneven. It was a replica of the broken rocking horse, an offering of the one thing she had to give. Maeve accepted it with a reverence that made the child's shoulders relax a fraction. "For you," Lily whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. It was the first time a voice other than the wind had dared to rise in this house. This small, wooden bird became the bridge. Lily started to orbit Maeve, a tiny satellite drawn to her quiet warmth. She would watch her cook, her small hands mimicking the kneading of dough. She would follow her to the garden, her fingers gently touching the new green shoots. The house began to fill with small sounds, the patter of Lily's feet, her soft hums, the occasional, hesitant question. Caleb watched this fragile alliance form from his usual distance, his face a landscape of conflicting emotions. He saw his daughter, who had been a silent ghost since the fire, slowly unfurling like a frozen bud. One evening, as Maeve tucked the worn blanket around the sleeping child, Lily's eyes fluttered open. She looked not at Maeve, but toward the dark corner where her father sat today. "Can you ask the sun to come back in Papa's eyes?" she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. The question, so simple and yet so profound, landed in the silent room like a thrown stone, striking both adults with its devastating clarity. Maeve's heart ached, and across the room, she saw Caleb flinch, as if struck by a physical blow. The storm came without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and freezing rain that turned the mountain into a churning sea of grey. It was as if the turmoil brewing inside the cabin had finally summoned its twin in the sky. For days, the wind howled, scraping at the walls, a relentless, shrieking lament. Inside, an even more dangerous storm was gathering. Caleb, caught out in the initial downpour while checking his traps, had come home soaked to the bone, his body racked with a deep, shuddering chill. At first, he ignored it, his stubborn pride a shield against any perceived weakness. But by the second day, a fever had taken hold, its heat a malevolent presence in the cold cabin. He lay on his cot, his breathing shallow and ragged, his skin radiating a dry, burning heat. He was a mountain succumbing to an internal fire. The deep, jagged scar on his forearm, an old burn Maeve had noticed before, was now an angry, inflamed red, the source of the poison spreading through him. Lily was terrified. She huddled by the hearth, her small face pale with a fear that was clearly not new. She had seen this fire before. She looked at Maeve, her eyes wide with a desperate plea that needed no words. Maeve knew this was the crucible. This was the moment the town's cruel joke would have to be confronted, not as a mockery, but as a desperate necessity. The fever was climbing, and Caleb had begun to murmur deliriously, his mind trapped in a landscape of smoke and shadow. His large frame, once a symbol of unbreachable strength, was now alarmingly vulnerable. To break the fever, she had to cool his body. She had to remove the sweat-soaked layers of clothing. She had to see what lay hidden beneath the fortress of his flannel and denim. It was a violation of the silent contract they had established, a crossing of a boundary that felt as sacred and dangerous as that locked wooden box in the wall. But Lily's terrified gaze gave her no choice. Survival had its own brutal logic, and it demanded intimacy where none had been offered. Maeve moved with a grim, steady purpose. She heated water, her hands working independently of the fear coiling in her stomach. She gathered clean rags. Lily watched her, a silent, frightened acolyte. "Papa is strong," Maeve said, her voice a low, calming anchor in the howling storm. "We will help him." Approaching the cot, she hesitated for only a second. Caleb's eyes were glassy, unfocused, lost in a past she could not see. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could hear. Gently, she began to unbutton his shirt. The fabric was damp and hot. As she peeled it back, she braced herself for the sight the town had so crudely described. But there was no fat. There was only ruin. Her breath caught in her throat, and she froze. What she saw was a testament to fire and agony. The whole left side of his torso, from his shoulder down to his hip, was a brutal landscape of scar tissue. The skin was a melted, twisted tapestry of pinks and whites, pulled taut and puckered in some places, eerily smooth in others. It was not the body of a man who had grown soft in isolation, it was the body of a man who had thrown himself in front of the flames. He had been a shield. Suddenly, the entire story of this broken man rearranged itself in her mind. The isolation, the silence, the haunted eyes, the child who lived in fear of fire, it all snapped into a devastatingly clear picture. The town's mockery was not just cruel, it was a profound and terrible ignorance. They had laughed at his armor, mistaking the very evidence of his sacrifice for a weakness. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over Maeve, not pity, but a deep, aching wave of respect and a fierce, protective anger. Her mission was no longer about a cruel joke or a paid service. It was about tending to the wounds of a hero who had never been acknowledged. Her hands, when she began to bathe him, were no longer hesitant. They were gentle, reverent, cleaning the map of his pain with a tenderness that was a prayer. For 2 days and 2 nights, Maeve was a sentinel. She moved between the fire and the cot, a tireless guardian against the fever that threatened to consume Caleb. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the battle within him. She bathed his scarred torso with cool water, her touch gentle on the ruined skin. She coaxed broth between his cracked lips. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, telling him stories she remembered from her own childhood, filling the barren room with the sound of a human voice that asked for nothing in return. Lily never left her side, a small, brave shadow helping to fetch rags and water, her fear slowly being replaced by a fragile hope. During the worst of it, Caleb cried out in his delirium, his hands clenching, his body arching in some remembered agony. He spoke a name, a single, broken word, Anna. It was a name spoken with the force of a soul being torn apart. Maeve knew then that Anna was the woman of the sewing basket, the mother of the rag doll, the ghost whose absence had hollowed out this house and this man. She placed a cool cloth on his forehead, her heart aching with a shared sense of loss. She had lost her family to a fever, he had lost his to a fire. They were both survivors of a terrible burning. On the 3rd morning, the wind died down, and a watery dawnlight filtered through the clean windows. The fever broke. Caleb's breathing deepened, becoming even and calm. He slept a true, healing sleep for the first time. Maeve, exhausted, sat in a chair by his side, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear. They were free of the fever's haze and the fog of delirium. He looked at her, truly saw her, sitting there, her face weary but her gaze steady. He saw the basin of water. He felt the cool dampness of the rags on his skin. He knew. His gaze dropped to his own scarred chest, then back to her face. There was no shame in his eyes, but a raw, aching vulnerability. A silent question. Maeve simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I saw," it said. "And I am still here." The first trip to town was a necessity. The storm had depleted their meager supplies, and Caleb, though still weak, was determined to provide. A new silence had settled between him and Maeve since the fever broke. It was no longer a silence of distance and suspicion, but one of shared experience, of a deep and unspoken understanding. He had looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and seen the light returning to her eyes. He owed that light to the woman who now walked beside him. When their wagon rattled down the main street, the town stopped to stare. It had been years since Caleb had shown his face, and never with the ghost child in tow. But the real shock was Maeve, walking with them not as a servant, but as a part of their silent procession. Mrs. Thatcher stood on the porch of the general store, her face a mask of sour disbelief. The cruel wager had clearly been lost. "Well, well," she called out, her voice dripping with venom, loud enough for all to hear. "Look what the mountain coughed up. Did you finally manage to scrub the beast clean, girl?" The laughter that followed was thin and nervous. Maeve flinched, her shoulders tightening. She expected Caleb to ignore it, to retreat back into the stone fortress of his silence as he always had. But he didn't. He stopped. He turned, not with rage, but with a cold, immense calm. He didn't look at Mrs. Thatcher. Instead, he looked at Maeve. In a single, deliberate movement, he stepped slightly in front of her, a living shield once more. He laid his hand gently on her shoulder, a simple, possessive, and profoundly public gesture. Then, he raised his head and met the matriarch's gaze. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried the weight of the mountain itself. "She is with me," he said. The 3 words were a wall. A declaration. A final, unbreakable boundary. He then led Maeve and Lily into the store, leaving the town in a stunned, gaping silence. Inside, he bought flour and salt, but then he did something more. He pointed to a bolt of blue calico cloth, the color of a clear summer sky. He paid for it and laid the heavy fabric in Maeve's arms. It was not a transaction. It was a promise. The seasons turned on the mountain, each one washing away a little more of the sorrow that had stained the land. The garden Maeve had tilled produced green beans and bright orange squash, a splash of vibrant life against the grey stone of the cabin. The sound of Lily's laughter, once as rare as a summer snow, became a frequent melody as she chased butterflies through the meadow. The locked wooden box in the wall was opened. Caleb did it one afternoon, using a small, iron key. Inside was a stack of letters tied with a ribbon and a single, silver ring. He showed them to Maeve, letting her see the artifacts of the life he had lost, not to burden her with his grief, but to share its weight. He was no longer just a man made of silence and stone, he was a man made of memory and survival, and now, a fragile, burgeoning hope. He began to speak more, his words still sparse, but chosen with care. He taught Lily how to identify bird calls. He showed Maeve which roots were good for medicine. He was slowly, carefully, rebuilding his world, and he was making a space for her inside it. Maeve took the blue calico cloth he had bought her and, in the evenings by the firelight, began to sew a dress. Her stitches were neat and even, each one a small prayer of gratitude. The dress was not for a journey away, but for a life being built right here. She was no longer a ghost haunting someone else's home, she was its heart, her quiet strength the fire that kept it warm. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a home. It was filled with the smell of baking, the warmth of the hearth, and the soft murmur of their 3 lives weaving together into a new and unexpected tapestry. They were a strange and scarred little family, forged in the crucible of a cruel joke and a raging fever, but they were whole. One evening in late summer, as the sun bled orange and purple across the peaks, the 3 of them sat on the porch. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. Lily was asleep in her father's lap, her small hand clutching the wooden bird Maeve had kept for her. Maeve was sewing the last button on the blue dress, her fingers moving with a quiet contentment. A comfortable silence enveloped them, a silence that was now a soft blanket, not a cold stone wall. Caleb looked at Maeve, at the way the fading light caught in her hair, at her capable hands that had brought life back to his home and peace back to his heart. He had been a man entombed, believing his life had ended in the fire with Anna. He had thought his scarred body was a mark of his failure to save her, a monstrous testament to his loss. But this quiet, resilient woman had looked upon his ruin and had not seen a monster. She had seen a man. She had tended to his wounds, both the visible and the invisible, with a grace that asked for nothing. She had shown him that survival was not the same as living. He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering hers, stilling her needle. Her skin was warm. He did not say a word. He did not have to. His touch spoke of gratitude, of protection, of a future he had never believed he would have. Maeve looked up from her sewing, her gaze meeting his. In his eyes, she no longer saw the vast, desolate emptiness of the man she had first met. She saw the reflection of the sunset, the quiet strength of the mountain, and for the first time, a clear and steady light that was all his own. The sun had come back to his eyes. They had earned this peace, a quiet harbor built from the wreckage of their pasts, a testament to the simple, profound truth that even the most frozen hearts can learn to thaw. This story teaches us a powerful lesson about judging others. The town saw Caleb as a monster because of his scars and his isolation, but they were blind to the truth. His appearance was a mark of incredible sacrifice and love. Maeve, who was also an outcast, was the only one who looked past the surface and saw the hero beneath. It reminds us that people's deepest pains and greatest strengths are often hidden from view. True compassion comes from looking beyond gossip and appearances to understand the heart of a person. We see how quiet acts of kindness, like baking bread or mending a shirt, can heal wounds that anger and violence never could. Maeve didn't change Caleb with force, she changed him with gentle, persistent care, showing that true strength is often found in quiet grace. Their story is a powerful reminder to always lead with empathy, because we never truly know the battles others are fighting. If this story of redemption and love touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more emotional and inspirational stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a new video that will warm your soul. Thank you for watching.